You are now listening to Protecting Your Nest with board-certified family medicine and obesity medicine specialist Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com. Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast. The dietary guidelines for Americans are updated every 5 years by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, also known as the USDA, and the Department of Health and Human Services, better known as HHS. The process begins with the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, a group of nominated individuals which reviews, quote, current nutrition research, unquote, and drafts a scientific report that the USDA and HHS use to develop the final guidelines. But do they really do their best to use all the available evidence? Are they sharing their recommendations without bias? Today's guest may have a different perspective, a perspective that may help you see more clearly why the dietary guidelines should not be taken for face value. Today's guest is Nina Teicholz, who is the executive director of the Nutrition Coalition, a nonprofit, nonpartisan group that is free of industry funding devoted to evidence-based nutrition policy, and an investigative science journalist and author. Her international bestseller book, The Big Fat Surprise, has upended the conventional wisdom on dietary fat, especially saturated fat, and challenged the very core of our nutrition policy. Nina has testified before the Canadian Senate and the U.S. Department of Agriculture about the need to reform guidelines so that they are based on sound science. She attended Yale and Stanford, where she studied biology and majored in American Studies and has a master's degree from Oxford University, and served as associate director of the Center for Globalization and Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Like myself, a former vegetarian, but unlike myself, I did vegetarian for about 8 years, she did it for about 25 years. So Nina, I really want to welcome you to Protecting Your Nest.
Thank you, Tony. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk to you.
Absolutely. I just want to firstly thank you for your service and your contribution to the medical community and just allowing many of us to question conventional wisdom. I do believe that by your example, many are now looking with skepticism whenever they review research or when presented with, an expectation to follow guidelines. In fact, I think the way we were trained, we're supposed to be skeptic when we looked at research, but we tend to just follow the headlines like our patients. So I really appreciate you being a leader in that space. So I do want to start off by making sure our listeners know who you are. I think most of them already do. Anybody that follows me probably follows you. But let's talk a little bit briefly about, what led to you writing your book, The Big Fat Surprise.
Well, I think I've told this story many times, so please forgive me of your listeners who, if they've heard this before, but I'm a journalist. So I was doing a series of investigative food stories for a magazine called Gourmet, which no longer exists, but they were doing fairly serious stories in the food space. And then I was assigned a story on trans fats. This is the early 2000s. And I'd never heard of trans fats at that point. I had really never done a story on nutrition. But I started to investigate that area, and what I found was so startling. I discovered stories such as professors who were researching trans fats, which was an unpopular subject because it threatened the vegetable oil industry, because trans fats are found in vegetable oils. And people told me they had been hired to go to meetings and heckle presenters who were giving out this information. People had been hired by the vegetable oil industry, by the margarine industry. And there were stories of people who had been visited, researchers who had been visited by officials from the margarine industry telling them, that they had to stop their research, or bullying them by writing nasty things about them in the medical and academic press. So these stories were so dazzling to me because I had grown up in a family where my father is an engineer, and we I had really been taught, and I had studied science in college. So everything that I had been taught about science, that it works in this calm methodological way. People respond to contrary views and try to accommodate them and challenge hypotheses. None of that seemed to be true in the world of nutrition, at least as I was encountering it. And sometimes I found that researchers were completely unwilling to talk about the subject of dietary fat. To challenge the notion that a low-fat diet might not be the best diet, they would hang up on me, or they would say, if you're going to talk about that, I'm not even going to speak to you. So I would sometimes just get off the phone shaking, like feeling like I was investigating the mob or some terrible scandal. Well, this, for a journalist, really says to you, there's a story here. And that sent me down the rabbit hole of all dietary fats, because dietary fats are so related. One replaces the other. So whole fat, non-fat, good fat, bad fat. I mean, we have had this debate, and it's been such a central pillar of our nutrition, our understanding of nutrition and our nutrition policy, that it really, it fascinated me. And I started writing, I got a book contract to write a book about trans fats. And then I expanded into this whole other world of really all dietary fats. I wrote a chapter on fish oil that we had to take out and never got published. But in the end, my book really focused on saturated fats, which was the fats that I think are the most consistently vilified as being bad for health and are in a number of different kinds of food, meat, cheese, dairy, eggs. And so the coconut oil. And I think my book was really the first to make a truly coherent, cohesive, sustained argument that saturated fats had been unfairly vilified, and in fact do not cause heart disease. So
yeah, it's perplexing. There's so much respect you have for scientists and people in these fields, and you really assume that any researcher would want to prove their hypothesis or disprove it. And that's just the nature of how we were trained. And then when you are faced with a simple conversation about fat and they push back, that really should definitely make you a little nervous about, well, why would they not want to talk about something like that? So it just, it breaks my heart that we live in a world that's not really what we think it is. And it just breaks my heart. So I know, so thank you for, again, I'm glad that you, it's almost like a random occurrence. You were kind of doing something else and it led you down this other path, which could arguably be foundational in putting us back on track and at least being open to looking at the world through a different lens. So again, I want to thank you for that. And so after you did your investigative journalism back in Chicago, where I live, we had Walter Jacobson, who was an investigative reporter, and he was known for, discovering all kinds of stuff. So when I think about you, I think about him. And, so I think that is a compliment. And, he definitely was great. But anyway, so you actually, through your research, help us see that maybe saturated fat doesn't cause heart disease after all. But then you shifted your focus to the dietary guidelines. So I guess my question is, what inspired you to focus on the guidelines?
Well, my book came out, and shortly thereafter, the proceedings were going on for the publishing of the 2015 dietary guidelines. The guidelines are updated every 5 years, and this was the update for 2015. And I read the scientific report that came out of the expert committee that had written this report, and it was a truly shocking experience for me. I mean, I had just spent nearly a decade to write my book and read thousands and thousands and thousands of studies, and had interviewed hundreds of individuals for that, and had read a great deal of science that was, I don't want to call it bad science, but science that clearly was ignoring arguments to the contrary, or ignoring the data, that their own data, or papers that were problematic. But I think that the expert report for the 2015 dietary guidelines was one of the most disturbing pieces of scientific work I had ever read. I mean, it denied so much of the science that I had just been reading. All these studies and everything that I had just spent years of my life reviewing, none of that was acknowledged. I mean, none of that science was in the dietary guidelines, and I just didn't understand how that could be true. I mean, there were so many things about the guidelines that were surprising. Like, for one, the diet they recommend it doesn't even provide all the nutrients needed for human life. So it falls short on major important nutrients like vitamin E, vitamin D, iron, choline. Why was that? Why should that be? And they are structured in a way that they ignore almost all of the clinical trials that have been conducted on and have been funded by the National Institutes of Health, and they instead rely on a weaker form of data called epidemiology, which I think we'll talk about later. But anyway, this report just really, it truly, I was deeply disturbed by it. And so I went to a foundation and I asked them, would you give me a grant? I would like to have a grant in order to have some time to formally analyze and write just a report of my findings on these 2015 guidelines. And I was given a grant to do that. And then part of that report was published in the British Medical Journal. And those findings and I think nobody really had ever criticized the dietary guidelines. And I don't know what gave me the chutzpah to think that I could single-handedly just do that and publish it in a major journal and think the scales would fall from everybody's eyes. But instead, there was the largest ever effort to retract the paper. I mean, the largest in recent history, signed by over 100, or I can't remember at this point. There were over 100 scientists who signed that, and they were mainly people involved in the guidelines or people who had been involved in the guidelines and their friends. So it really made me understand a number of things, but one of them was that the power of these guidelines, they're extraordinarily powerful, and that you don't just willy-nilly go up and challenge a major government policy. I mean, these guidelines inform not only all education for healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, dietitians, K through 12 education, but there's $100 billion that goes out to school lunches, feeding programs for the elderly, school breakfast, programs for women and infant children that affect 1 in 4 Americans every month. And so all those programs are informed by the guidelines. So is the military. The military has an obesity problem. So they're so influential. And I didn't even realize that when I started on my crusade to try to just point out the scientific flaws. It just led me down a path of wanting to try to bring better science to the guidelines. I thought that if we could point out the science, maybe there would be some response to that. If we could bring science to them, would there not be some response to this obvious, what I thought was maybe just an oversight? But that was a long story, and it turns out our efforts were not successful.
Yeah, well, it's a necessary story to frame why we're talking today. And as a physician, I never felt I had time to dive into the weeds and understand or question guidelines. We were trained to follow the guidelines, and the assumption is that everything that we are being taught or being asked to do is evidence-based, because that's how it's presented. So my pharmacy colleagues, my nutrition professionals, and anybody out there who shares diet as a form of healing, they just assume that that's what was done. And I think I want to dive into that a little bit. But I am happy that you either had no fear or you simply didn't know who you were facing when you decided to take on this challenge? Because maybe if you knew what you uh, know now, you would have paused. But thank God you didn't do that. And then because of your efforts, we now have people like myself who are not afraid to stand on the rooftop and yell a little bit and ask for things to be different. So anyway, I feel it's important we provide a little background related to research as we frame this discussion. I just happened to be studying an introduction to research course with the University of Western States, and we reviewed that in primary research there are two types of studies. You have experimental studies and observational studies, and you had mentioned epidemiological studies. That's more aligned with observational studies, and they're used to demonstrate a hypothesis. That's it. While experimental studies are used to demonstrate causal relationships, in other words, causation. So, for example, a randomized controlled trial is an example of a study that's an experimental study. Now, so my question to you is, and I think I know the answer, and I think our listeners probably know the answer, but I just want to speak to it. When the dietary guidelines were determined, what type of studies did they use to make their decisions? Were they observational studies like the things you see with food frequency questionnaires, or were they experimental studies, which you would see with a randomized controlled trial? What was your experience when you looked at that data?
Right. Well, I want to answer that question, but I want to first just emphasize the point that you just made, which is the importance of having experimental data that can show causation before approving any kind of modality, whether it be a pill or a device or a diet. I think that it would be it will resonate with your doctor and patient listeners here to understand that when you're given your prescriber or given a pill, that pill must have gone through, or vaccine, it has to go through a randomized controlled clinical trial before it can be approved and allowed for use, because it can't, because that is considered the gold standard of science, and you must test it before you apply it to the population. It would never be accepted, this kind of weak observational data that is, as Tony said, it's to suggest hypotheses, but you could never prescribe a pill based on only that kind of data. But in nutrition, most of the recommendations that are given are based purely on this observational data, so this hypothesis generating data. And it's really quite shocking. Well, that was one of the really, truly surprising things that I found, that, the recommendation, just to give you a few examples. I mean, so each recommendation has a slightly different history of the past of how it came about. And there are some clinical trials that are used as the basis for some recommendations. But that's when the clinical trials agree with what basically the USDA has decided is the diet that they prefer, which is, this diet was decided upon back in 1980 when the guidelines were started, and that diet is high grain, about 6 servings of grains a day. At least half of them have to be refined. Low fat dairy and lean meat only, and that's because of the saturated fat, the cap on saturated fats. And you're supposed to eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. And now there's nuts, seeds, and seafood. Okay, so some of those recommendations do have some clinical trial evidence behind them, but the vast majority don't, or they're even contradicted by clinical trial data. So, we have the government actually has what's called a dietary pattern that they prefer, which is, assuming, they say people consume foods in patterns. We don't consume just single foods. So they have a list of healthy foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, seeds, nuts, low fat, dairy and lean meat. That is called a dietary pattern, and that is based almost exclusively on observational data. And that was deeply disturbing to me because that is not rigorous data. Again, as Tony said, it's meant to generate hypotheses. It's not meant to prove them. And I think even worse, there is clinical trial, that is to say, more rigorous data that contradicts those recommendations that the government is giving. So there's clinical trial, better data that is being ignored. And so it's complicated, and it's a little bit of a complicated story to tell. But I mean, it means that our guidelines are really just sort of educated guesses, most of them, and they're not recommendations that are based on data that is considered any kind of proof. So this is disturbing, and I'll just add one other point here. I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but the whole methodology of how these expert committees who are appointed every 5 years, that the methodology that is used to review the science is not, it's their own made up methodology that has never been verified by any outside authority. And when this process was recently reviewed by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, they reviewed, for the first time, there was an outside peer review of the dietary guideline process. It was mandated by Congress because Congress was deeply concerned about the guidelines. This National Academies review said, it's super important that the guidelines upgrade their methodology to one of the internationally verified standards that exist out there. There are a number of standards that have been developed around the world for how to review science, how to prioritize, this science over that science. How do what is the way that you can judge science reliably and in a way that can be replicated, right? Replication is the standard of good science. Well, the USDA rejected that recommendation, and they stuck with their own methodology, which again has not been verified, and in quite a number of ways would not be considered. There's just a number of ways in which it really it falls short of what international standards require.
It's disheartening. If you think about it, I'm taking some training so I can be a little sharper on nutrition. And of course, I'm a big fan of functional medicine, which is the root cause of disease approach. And the first chapter of my research course talks about, that clinical trials have to show causation. And to think that the folk that are making these guidelines would just ignore the most foundational part of research is perplexing to me. And that's why I wanted to dive a little bit into that aspect. But you segued a little bit into another area I wanted to touch on just briefly, just to get a little granular and help our listeners understand why we're having this conversation. So another thing that we reviewed in my class is the need to distinguish between correlation and causation. So with correlation, we are not able to manipulate in any way, but instead must just observe outcomes like what's done with the food frequency questionnaire. And imagine, someone sending you a questionnaire and say, well, how many ounces of steak did you eat in 2020? And what's the chances you'll really be able to answer that question accurately? So that's one thing. And then you have causation, which in that scenario, you can literally compare one group to another. For example, one group could be given a low carb diet, the other group given a low fat diet, and then the outcomes from a study like that can actually show causation. So when we're attempting to go from this association phase, which is more with those observational epidemiological type studies, to causation, which is the more experimental studies, there are some questions that my professor suggests that Dr. Hampton needs to ask. And, so here are some of the questions. And by the way, a yes answer to any of these questions essentially prevents us from ending up saying that causation exists. So what I want you to do, Nina, is to answer rather the experts forming the dietary guidelines answer these questions with a yes or a no. So the first question is, was there, I know it's kind of a funny thing, right? Was there bias? So let's answer that question. Yes or no, Nina, was there bias when you looked at this science?
I think in many cases there was. I can give you an example of that.
Give me an example.
But so I just need to explain that the committee, the expert committee, is divided up in subcommittees that take on different topics. And one of the things that we're currently doing is really analyzing the conflicts of interest on those committees, and you can see that bias exists, or potentially exists, because, say, there was a new set of guidelines now for birth to 24 months. That's the first time they've got such guidelines ever been issued. Well, more than half of the participants on that subcommittee had significant, and in some cases very long-standing, ties with all the major formula and toddler food companies, like Nestle and Mead Nutrition and Similac. And so that affected more than half. That was significant for more than half of the members on those committees. Well, how could that? Those are conflicts of interest, which are, potentially could very well produce bias on that subcommittee. Another subcommittee where I found, and of course this is near and dear to my heart, so I know this especially well, but on the saturated fat committee, the committee in charge of looking at saturated fat included one of the longest standing researchers who has been trying to prove that saturated fats is bad for health. Her name is Linda Van Horn. She was a close colleague of, it's probably too much in the weeds for your listeners, but she has been trying to prove that saturated fats are bad for health since the 1970s. And she has another colleague on that committee who's also been doing the same. And there was another person on that committee. There were only 4 people. There's another person on that committee who had long-standing relationships with trying to promote polyunsaturated fats, businesses that promote basically seed oils and omega-3 oils. Well, if you stop eating saturated fats, those businesses profit and benefit because you're switch from saturated to polyunsaturated fats, which are usually vegetable oils. So there were numerous forms of bias on that subcommittee. And in every subcommittee that you looked at, there were, I would say 3/4 of the committee as a whole had significant relationships with the food and pharmaceutical industries, which are conflicts of interest that tend to create bias. Of course, bias is created in other ways. There was people who have, as I described, people have long-standing commitments to existing hypotheses and are unlikely to want to change their minds. I'll just give you one other example. There was a subcommittee on the frequency of eating, and there was a member of that committee who has close ties to a company that has a series of, shakes and snacks and various things that recommends eating 5 times a day. Well, this puts that person in a state of conflict with the idea that maybe intermittent fasting is a good idea, it's an alternative theory for which there is some data now, and some contrary data. But that person definitely had a conflict of interest going into that subcommittee. So I think that, yes, bias could be demonstrated. I think the other form of bias that I think is sort of general to the whole process, which was, I think, openly stated by one of the USDA officials who runs the process. There's an office of some 30 people who run this process and that is housed at USDA. She said, if everyone followed the guidelines, everyone would be healthy. So it reflects a bias of the institution for their own set of recommendations, which is perhaps natural for people who've been working on them for, in some cases, decades. But it is inimical to the practice of science, where you should be open to contrary ideas. But here is a bureaucrat in an institution saying, we are right, and there can be no other answer. And so that is not the practice of good science. So that's an overarching kind of bias in favor of the status quo, a kind of a bias for preserving the existing traditional dogma.
Yeah, I can see that. And it's, the interesting thing about these questions that my professor said you need to ask is that we're on question one and we can't get past that because if we say there's bias, then you can't show causation. So we're already in trouble. And it kind of breaks my heart just to, again, I think you're breaking my heart all day because everything
Sorry.
we're talking about is like the reality of all of this is frightening. And I really hope a lot of people please share this episode, particularly if you have a health professional, a clinician who's a nutrition professional, maybe a doc who's too busy taking care of your needs if you're a patient or a colleague of yours. Make sure you share this because they have not heard this. Nina's book was wonderful, but most of my colleagues haven't read her book. They're too busy being doctors and nurses. And so make sure you share that. And so we have one question where we clearly show that maybe there's some bias. Greater than 50% of the committee members have relationships. They also mention, or should I say, my professor mentions that the results cannot be attributed to chance. And when I heard him say that, it kind of reminded me of what I learned in research is that you should be able to see some data out there that would say, hey, we've done this, we've proven this before, blah, blah, blah. But when you think about the chances that the results were attributed to chance, anything come to mind for you?
So what do you mean attributable to chance?
Like the chances that this is like, it's almost like, it's like a placebo effect. Like, so the chances that the data they've gathered, it's like, oh, it can, anything can happen. And maybe this time it just happened. But are there other things out there that would show that, no, this is not by chance because we've proven it elsewhere? And
Right.
the irony, yeah, I think that's how that you're supposed to look at that particular question.
Well, the way that I interpret that is that we're talking now about observational data, um, and for observational data, again, the kind of data that suggests hypotheses, there's always a chance that that hypothesis can be right, right, and sometimes observational data is so strong that you can assume causation. So I know. So let me give you an
Mm-hmm.
example for that, which is that they used that the policy officials used the data on smoking, even though it was only observational data, to assume causation because the data was so the magnitude of the association was so strong. So, in other words, people who were heavy smokers had a 20 to 30 times greater chance of getting lung cancer than never smokers. Okay, 20 to 30 times. In nutrition, the magnitude of effects that are found in their studies, and again, using much weaker data because you're talking about data where people have to report on what they eat, as Tony's kind of explained a bit, which is that, when people lie and can't remember what they eat, they lie about it and they can't remember. In nutrition, those numbers are nowhere near 20 to 30. They're almost always lower than 2. They're at 1.14, 1.2, 1 point. I mean, they're rarely above 1.2. So, the reason that it's important that that magnitude be larger is that if it's larger, you can rule out the possibility that that this could be just an association by chance. I think that's the way that I understand that question, and that is
Yeah.
why there's a set of criteria called the Bradford-Hill criteria for how you assume causation from observational data. In other words, when is that data good enough to say, okay, this is cause and effect data here?
Yeah. And we
And
touched on that in class too. So that's a good point you're bringing up.
so the number one thing on that list, which is not just number one, it's number one because it's the most important criteria. And if you don't have it, you don't even move to number two. Number one is the magnitude of that association. Is it 20 to 30 or is it 1.2? And so in the field of epidemiology, there's sort of a general rule of thumb, and it's been written in the scientific literature, that that number should be at least 2 or 3, so that in order to even be taken seriously, to suggest that this might be something to move on to number 2 of Bradford Hill criteria. But nutrition data never reaches 2 or 3. I mean, almost never. So the quality of that data means that you cannot rule out the chance that this might just be a random association. There's so many associations. I mean, most associations turn out to be wrong because so many things are associated with each other. I mean, I always put up the chart in my lectures showing that that you can associate margarine consumption with rate of divorce in Maine. They're perfectly associated. Does that mean margarine is causing divorce? I mean,
Right.
or that
Crazy.
if you reduce your margarine consumption, you have a better chance of staying married? There's so many false associations, and that's fine. You're just generating hypotheses that need to be tested, but they need to be tested. They cannot be used as the basis of population-wide recommendations, and they cannot be considered the gold standard of evidence, which they're currently treated as. And I think that is not, that's not an accurate evidence base for such recommendations.
It sounds like our friends with the dietary guidelines are not passing their basic research class. And the last question that my professor spoke about was those confounding factors. And I think about those people who, say, yeah, I can kind of guess how many ounces of steak I ate, but then they ended up being, a smoker, or they don't exercise, or some other confounding factor. And in order for this evidence to be, show causation, you can't have these confounding factors. So, but I think the nature of epidemiological studies would suggest in my brain that you're going to end up with that. So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, it's true. I mean, this is the confounding factors. I think some of them researchers try to adjust for, such as whether or not you're a smoker, but there's so many that they can't adjust for. I mean, there's so many behaviors they've come to understand affect health. How you sleep. Do you follow your doctor's orders on other things? Do you go to, one of the factors that affects health is whether or not you go to concerts or other kinds of gatherings where none of us can do that now. But, they don't measure that in epidemiological studies. And here's one important factor. The 2 largest epidemiological databases in the U.S. have not historically measured sugar consumption. Well, we know that sugar is a potent factor in disease, in obesity and diabetes and other diseases. So if they cannot adjust for sugar. I mean, this was confirmed to me in an email by the head of the Harvard School of Public Health. They simply can't adjust for your sugar consumption. That's a major factor that they can't adjust for. And you're right that in all those scary studies about meat being deadly or causing disease, meat eaters also tend to exercise less. They smoke more. They tend to be more overweight, and you can just imagine. I mean, who is eating meat over the past 30 years? They're all the people who have consistently ignored everything that their doctor has told them. Those are there's been one of the strongest health messages of the last 20, 30 years has been don't eat meat, or reduce your meat. So if you're a big meat eater, you're somebody who does not follow any kind of rules. And we know from scientific studies that people who adhere to rules tend to be healthier. Just the fact of being what's called a healthy adherer. Those are healthier people. They're people who take their pills. They exercise regularly. They get up at a regular time in the morning. They're people who follow the rules, and they tend to be healthier for reasons that we don't fully understand.
Wow. Yeah. And it's just common sense. And I think that makes sense. And you can, and you tend to follow the rules with different parts of your life, and things tend to go better. So it makes sense. And so I really I'm glad we touched on some of the the granular things, just to give people just an understanding of why it's important to understand how the decisions are being made and why what they're doing doesn't really align with what any researcher would be happy with. So I'm happy you shared that. And I know you mentioned already that at the end of the day, if you follow the guidelines, are you going to be healthy or not? And when I sometimes think about the guidelines and I think about the recommendations for fruit, for example, when I have a diabetic in front of me, it makes me cringe that that this would be okay for that diabetic. So this idea that if we only followed the guidelines, we would be healthy seems like a farce in a way. So any additional thoughts on that? This idea that if you just follow the guidelines, you would be okay. If you just exercised a little bit more, you would be okay. If you just, ate a little bit less, all those things you hear out there. But what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I would like to offer a couple different thoughts, if that's all right. I would like to just point out a couple of other ways in which this round of the dietary guidelines would not meet the expectations of your average researcher. And then I'll say something about the scope of the guidelines. But first, in this round of the guidelines, they decided not to look at any studies on weight loss. So if you're going to the guidelines thinking this is a good solution for my overweight patients, you should understand that there was no science reviewed on that subject.
But everybody in healthcare assumes that that's true. I mean, most people assume that you follow the guidelines to help you get to ideal weight and things like that. So that doesn't make any sense. At least that's the perception.
Right. And exactly. So one of the reasons, part of our work was to reveal what kind of science was actually being reviewed and what do the guidelines actually, what is the evidence for the guidelines? Well, if they're ignoring all the science on weight loss, they really cannot say that they're a set of, following this advice will help people lose weight because they've not looked at that science. And in fact, I know from having reviewed the scientific literature very deeply on the guidelines that in numerous trials where the guidelines have been tested, large NIH-funded trials, people put on the guidelines. In other words, given the food pyramid or given the formulary for what you should eat, they did not lose weight compared to a control group eating a regular diet. In fact, there's one absolutely stunning study comparing the guidelines to a junk food diet. I mean, a diet that was supposed to be high in junk food. And the guidelines do not perform better. I mean, they might have performed better on one outcome, but in terms of weight loss, there was no advantage. Then a junk food diet. It
doesn't surprise me because of, like I said, if I have a patient who's diabetic, who typically may be a little overweight, and they are being told to eat, maybe 4 to 5 servings of fruit, and just one banana could be 28 carbs, which is equivalent. You divide it by 4, that's equivalent to 7 teaspoons of sugar. That's just one piece of fruit. So clearly that they're going to struggle with their weight, not recognizing there's a lot of sugar in a lot of these fruits. But anyway, I digress. Well, go ahead.
No. And you're right. And in addition to that fruit, the guidelines also allows, remember, 6 servings of grain and up to 10% of your calories is sugar. So in that experiment, they were actually feeding people slices of cake because that's part of the guidelines. That fits the formulary. Yes. So that fits the guidelines. And of course, it's consistent with what you see children getting fed at schools that is all based on the guidelines. They're getting donuts. And then they get whatever those sun chips are for lunch. I mean, this is all consistent with the guidelines. And when experts decry the Americans and how much pizza they are eating, Domino's Pizza is actually a partner with the USDA to supply lunches to children's schools because that follows the guidelines. It is grains, tomato sauce, and some skim mozzarella cheese, and that follows the guidelines. So please do not blame us for our overconsumption of pizza. It is in the guidelines. That's part of the guidelines. Right. Anyway, I'll give another example that was stunning to me in reviewing this iteration of the guidelines was that they somehow were able to not find any virtually any studies on low carbohydrate restriction, any kind of low carb diets, ketogenic diets. They found only one study, despite the fact that there are, by some counts now, more than 100 clinical trials on that diet, which has proven shown to have health benefits for people who are metabolically unwell. And somehow this dietary guideline committee could not find that scientific literature. And they did that by creating exclusion criteria that were almost guaranteed to exclude all of those studies. But so that is concerning. And another reason to question whether the guidelines are truly doing their job in terms of, I mean, even as mandated by Congress, their job is to comprehensively review all the science that is available at the time. And I think we can say that did not occur. It also did not occur in the case of saturated fats, where they literally ignored the last decade of science on saturated fats. It's such an important decade of science because that is when really there has been a major reconsideration of the danger of saturated fats, with now almost 20 review papers saying we got it wrong on saturated fats. There's no evidence that they have any affect clinical trial data. There's no clinical trial data to show that they have any effect on cardiovascular or total mortality. Almost 20 review papers from different teams of scientists around the world, all that data was ignored. So that's quite disturbing. And I think that perhaps most disturbing, if that's not upsetting enough, is the fact that dietary guidelines, they are scoped to address only the prevention of disease, meaning they only look at prevention in healthy people. They are not designed to provide any advice or treatment to people who are overweight, obese, diagnosed with diabetes, heart disease, any of the diet-related chronic diseases from which people suffer. They have not reviewed that literature. They do not have anything to say to those populations, even though Congress has mandated them to be the diet guidelines to be for the general public. Those are direct words out of the law. And also, when the guidelines were released, both secretaries of USDA and HHS came out and said, these guidelines are for all Americans. Well, how can that be when 60% of America has been diagnosed with one or more diet-related chronic disease? And these guidelines are not looking at the science on those for those people. So they really are only for the 40% that have not been diagnosed with the disease. Some people would put that number at 12%. According to an analysis of government data, there are only 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy, meaning they don't have a combination of symptoms that would combine to give them metabolic syndrome. And it's very worrisome because those guidelines inform, direct, or dictate the foods that are given to people through school lunches and all those programs I mentioned earlier. And those populations have even higher rates of diet-related diseases. Obesity in the Black community is, I think, almost at 50%. Diabetes is a multitude higher in Black and brown communities than it is in white communities. And yet, and this food is given to them and they have no choice. They're essentially captive populations this is the only food they have to eat. And yet it's based on science that does not look at their conditions. So that is a terrible mismatch. And I don't think that doctors, again, or patients understand that these guidelines really are not for people who have tipped over into metabolic ill health. They believe that the guidelines are for everyone. But I think as science has evolved really to understand that giving a one-size-fits-all diet to people, regardless of their degree of metabolic health, whether they're Black or brown or might have a different kind of metabolism.
Mhm.
It really is not appropriate to have a one size fits all solution for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. And if we are to have guidelines, and I know some people don't believe we should. I know when I talked to Adele Height, she doesn't like guidelines in general, and I understand her argument too.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to lean towards we're probably going to have them, so we need to fix it,
Right.
But let me tell you some. If we are to have guidelines, they should be designed in such a way to help people who need them the most, and to ignore the people who need it the most, which unfortunately is the majority of Americans and probably the majority of people in the world, is irresponsible. To be honest with you, and when I pulled up the new guidelines in preparation for this conversation. It's a beautiful booklet. It's long, but it's beautifully written, and it makes you feel warm and fuzzy. But then you realize that it's not going to help people, at least the people I see, and that 50% obesity number, it feels a lot higher in practice. It's not as high as it once was because I'm a low carb doctor who helps people. But I tell you, if you just you just go to the local Walmart or the mall, that number is higher than 50%. But I understand those numbers. So, and I know, man, we're going to soon recover from COVID-19 pandemic. But what I'm finding is that the much slower pandemic is the pandemic of chronic disease caused by excessive starch and sugar in our diet. And that's going to continue to haunt us even after people get vaccinated and things look better. So when I wrote an op-ed, by the way, that op-ed was inspired by you and the Nutrition Coalition.
Thank you.
And so I really appreciate you guys and the inspiration you provided. And that was written in Chicago Tribune this past summer. And for those who are listening, I'll definitely provide a link in the show notes. And in that op-ed, I shared my personal experience of reversing diabetes in patients on a low carb diet. Thankfully, the American Diabetes Association is one organization that now offers a low carb or a keto diet as one of their options. However, it appears that the guidelines, as you suggested, they really don't help communities of color because they tend to be the ones suffering from chronic illnesses. So, any additional thoughts about that concept, the fact that in communities of color who probably need it the most, they are the ones who will not, will be harmed in some ways by the guidelines?
I've thought so much about this particular issue in the last year, and I helped write a report that for a new alliance called the Food for Health Alliance. It's a group. It's an alliance of groups that care about minority communities. It includes the NAACP and Hispanic groups and groups that represent Native Americans. Anyway, we did an analysis of the evidence base for the dietary guidelines that just came out, and found that just under 95% of the scientific reviews that were conducted for these guidelines did not take into account race or ethnicity or low socioeconomic status, and were conducted primarily on white, mostly middle class or upper middle class populations. Well, that is a stunning finding. I mean, if you do not have, part of me thinks, yes, we all have a common biology, and our mitochondria work in the same way, and there's probably not vast differences in terms of our basic functions, but it is true there are ways in which people from different ethnic and racial backgrounds do have differences in their biologies, and they also have different food cultures, and so the guidelines cannot reflect any of that because they have no data on it. They just have no data. They don't, if vitamin D, if African American communities need to have more vitamin D because they absorb that more slowly, or if or there's a number of biological differences and cultural differences that are completely overlooked by the guidelines because they have no data. And it's interesting that you say that beautiful and book that they USDA published that's so warm and fuzzy and makes you feel good. And they say in there, we care so much. And this was true throughout the whole process of producing the guidelines, saying it's so important for us to consider minority communities, and it's very important for us to think about this. I think there was a lot of awareness of it, but they just don't have any data to be able to act on those desires. And then I think the other component of this is, as you say, in these minority communities and in poor communities that rely heavily on government food, those, it's the USDA nutrition assistance programs, again, $100 billion a year of food is handed out. And if you are giving people a high grain diet with lots of fruit, when they are given to communities with higher rates of all of these diseases, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, that diet is very likely not just not helping them, but is making them worse. I mean, if you look at the different formularies for food, I mean, as I told you, Domino's Pizza has a contract with USDA. So does PepsiCo, serving all of their junk food products. Most of the cereals handed out through the Women and Infant Children program are sweet. They're like sweetened checks and all these sweetened grains that they give them. And meanwhile, they hardly give them any eggs. It's really, and they give them juice, which is just sugar in a bottle. I mean, it really is a kind of tragic mismatch between the guidelines and these communities that they aim to serve. They just don't have the flexibility. They don't have the data to serve them.
Yeah, that's too bad. And I hate it. It just drives me crazy. I think about, grains. And so while you were talking, I said, let me just look up quinoa, which is, I'm looking at it, a seed that's packed with protein, fiber, and nutrients. But they even say in these comments, but it's not a low-carb food. Interesting that they would say that. A cup of cooked quinoa has more than 39 grams of carbs. Now, let's put that in perspective. Now, this is something they would recommend as a healthy grain, but it's got 39 carbs. So if you're a diabetic, you have 38 carbs in soda. Let's say that first. So now we're consuming something that has more carbs than what you find in soda. And if you divide that number by 4, you have nearly 10 teaspoons of sugar. So are there people out there that can eat quinoa and be fine? Absolutely. They're insulin sensitive and they can tolerate it just fine. And I have no problem with them. But for my diabetics, I don't want them to eat quinoa and have 10 teaspoons of sugar. And now they have to chase that with some insulin. It doesn't make sense. Now, I got some good news for you, Nina. I just found out that you may know this already, but I went by Chipotle. Do they have Chipotle in your area?
Yes, I think I tweeted this story out when it came out.
Did you?
I think I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, you know what I'm going to say. And I had not, I knew they were testing cauliflower rice, but I did not know that they, in my area, that they had started serving cauliflower rice with their bowls. So, and, I didn't look at their numbers, but typically you're going to get 4 to 5 carbs, 4 to 6 carbs for a serving. So the only problem is you got to pay extra for it. That's the, negative, but that is what it is. So, but I think that there's hope. And I just hate that people are being encouraged to overconsume this non-essential nutrient called grains. And as you and I know, I've had guests, Dr. Berry, I've had the Black Carnivore, Dr. Kristen Bear, who are all carnivores, and they don't have problems with not getting enough fiber because they're eating, they're not constipated. So it's all like an exaggeration of reality when they tell you just got to have these things. So, but what's really perplexing to me, Nina, is the idea. I was on Danny Davis's couch conversation with the doctors, which is a Facebook thing I do on Mondays at 7 p.m. And we talk about various topics. So on one iteration of it, we had my regular guest who's on it, Dr. Terry Mason, who's been featured in a lot of the vegetarian and vegan documentaries. And we also had a cardiologist, used to be one of the guys who was one of the leaders with the cardiology group, and another cardiologist within my system. And they were, very happy to suggest that you have to go vegan to prevent heart disease. What's perplexing for me is that your own College of Cardiology in June of 2020 is now stating that saturated fat is not associated with heart disease, but yet it's almost like they didn't get the memo, because there's still this taboo with low carb and keto diets. And so your thoughts on, why are the cardiologists in particular, and shout out to all the cardiologists who are listening, by the way. I think we have we like Dr. Brett Scher because he's gotten the memo. But my question is, why aren't the cardiologists hearing what we're hearing? Even their own college has stated that there's not an issue. Why do you think this is still an issue?
Well, cardiologists they have been trained to rely mainly on pills, and they will give a nod to diet, but they tend to find, because they recommend the dietary guidelines, they tend to find that diet doesn't work. So people go off and they try to eat more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and they don't get any healthier. And so I think there's probably this sense in the cardiology community that we would like to help people with nutrition and lifestyle, but it really just doesn't seem to work very well. So then they will. And then there are guidelines that you just have to put people on medication. Those are, and they typically are LDL cholesterol lowering medications. That's the low density lipoprotein cholesterol, and that is, and the cardiology community is very focused on LDL cholesterol being even a potentially causative agent in heart disease. Although there is quite a lot of literature disputing that, but that focus on LDL makes them hostile to saturated fat, because saturated fat also raises LDL. Some a lot, some a little. It's definitely a food that will raise your LDL. It also is the only food that is known to raise your HDL, which is your good cholesterol. But cardiologists have sort of given up on HDL for various reasons. I think mainly because they couldn't find a drug to treat HDL.
Right.
So it's just like the drugs that they found killed people. So
That's funny.
The cardiology community is very dependent and on pharmaceutical interests. But the way out of that is, as Dr. Steve Nissen at the Cleveland Clinic has pointed out. And actually, I first pointed this out in my book, which is that raising LDL through diet does not have an impact on cardiovascular events or mortality down the line. Diet works differently from drugs. Without getting into the argument about LDL, which I think you can just avoid, is just to say that diet works differently than drugs, whether it's because a food comes in a matrix with all different kinds of nutrients and vitamins and different things, fats and proteins, and everything affects your body. And so you cannot just focus on LDL, but there are so many trials showing that when LDL is raised by diet, there is zero correlation with cardiovascular events or cardiovascular deaths. And so diet just works differently, and we cannot assume they are in parallel. But why? But this is a hard distinction to point out. Nobody wants to undermine the rush towards PCSK9 inhibitors and the rules on statins. There's that's very dominant in the cardiovascular community. And I will add that the American Heart Association still vehemently
Mm-hmm.
stands behind its position, which it single-handedly launched in 1961. So it is the original author of the hypothesis that saturated fats cause heart disease, and they are not backing off.
Wow.
So, but again, they recently came out with a paper, what they called their Presidential Advisory on Saturated Fats, and their whole argument was about LDL. So I think but I hope that more cardiologists can, sort of follow in the steps of Dr. Nissen in the thinking that, separate out your thinking on diet from drugs.
Right.
Understand that diet works differently, and that the large, multiple, randomized controlled clinical trials just do not show that LDL rises in the same way. And one other sort of nuance on that is that saturated fat raises, for people who understand this kind of detail, but saturated fat raises the kind of LDL particle that is large and buoyant,
That's right.
and it is thought to be far less associated with heart disease, if at all. And it lowers the small, dense LDL particles. So it is actually an actor for good when it comes to your LDL pattern and density. And again, remember, it is the only food that consistently raises the HDL, which, if you still believe in HDL, is also good. So I think that this can be, and that work on particle size is largely by Ronald M. Krauss. So your listeners can look him up. But there's, and I also will provide you some links to when this podcast goes out for people who want to look into this in some more depth about the reviews of saturated fat. I think these are things worth thinking about, because allowing more saturated fats into the diet allows the kinds of foods that can replace carbohydrates. And I think that the cardiology community, many of them may be aware of the beneficial effects on nearly 100% of cardiovascular risk factors that come when grains and sugars are reduced in the diet. So, and this has been shown in numerous experiments where inflammatory markers go down, HDL goes up, triglycerides go down, CRP is reduced. There's just of the 34 cardiovascular markers that are used regularly or in specialty cases, the vast majority are improved when fats are increased or fat and protein are increased and carbohydrates are reduced. And if you liberate saturated fats, then people can eat more of those fat and protein foods. So there's an incentive there that you can actually help people heal from heart disease.
Yeah, I've seen it in my practice, and I've just seen, I guess if we were to use the term metabolic syndrome, and when you make these, no pill can attack all the various components of metabolic syndrome. You can definitely take a statin and work on your LDL, but it's not going to really increase that HDL and lower the triglycerides like diet. Clearly, if you reduce the sugar and starch, you're going to shrink your belly. So now your waist circumference looks better. The inflammation that's reduced, all that glycation that occurs in your arteries from sugar floating around. So now your blood sugars are better and your blood pressure is better. So there is no pill that'll do all of the things that diet will do. And as you've suggested, large, small particle sizes, they'll figure out eventually. We just need to align with what we're going to measure. And again, there are some people in my practice who are measuring the particle sizes, some who aren't. Some who are doing coronary artery calcium score testing like me, some who aren't. We need to be more aligned. And things like coronary artery calcium score testing should be a standard, even though our health system only charges $49. So it's a nice value proposition to see if you have any calcium in your arteries. But it should be free, it should be covered. And it's not covered by a lot of the health insurers. So I really... I'm hopeful, and I think you're hopeful because you're doing this work, and I guess one of the last few questions for you is, so how the heck do we get out of this mess? So talk a little bit about you're the expert. I'm just kidding. So tell me, I know you're doing work with Nutrition Correlation, but what the average person who's listening, rather as a clinician or a person who receives care from clinicians, what should they do to help move the needle in the right direction?
Well, that's a big question. I think, I assume that people who are listening are in very different stages of understanding or skepticism, or they may have just listened to this and thought, "Oh, this is all nonsense." So I want to be respectful for people who have all come from all different backgrounds. Again, it took me almost a decade to write my book, and I was not convinced at all by myself. I mean, really, even in the final year of writing, I would lay on the floor and cry to my husband almost every night, saying, "Am I sure I'm right? Is this right? It must be wrong. I have to go back and check everything." It's such a major shift in thinking from the way that we were all brought up. Yeah, and remember, I was a vegetarian and wouldn't touch meat for more than 2 decades. So I want to be respectful for where people are. I would say that, this is not to plug my book, but I would, if you can read my book, The Big Fat Surprise, it has 150 pages of references. It is a very good resource, and it tells a story. It was called a nutrition thriller by The Economist, which means that it is apparently easy to read, I've been told. But I think it's also possible to watch some of the YouTube videos out there, and try to just be open to a different approach to maybe one that you've been using, and trying to understand metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, what the history has been on saturated fats, vegetable oils. I mean, these are all topics that take a while to learn about. And then I think one of the things that I love about nutrition is that everybody can do their own N=1 experiment. So if you think that this is all nonsense, just try it. I mean, there's no harm in trying out a different approach. I mean, we cannot all challenge all science. Like, we can't challenge the science on air pollution because we can't do our own personal clinical trials on air pollution very easily, but we can do our own experiment on our own bodies and see what happens, which I think is a beautiful thing. So people can experiment on themselves and see how it works. I would only caution that if you decide to do a low carb diet, to give it, at least a month or more, because there really is a transition period during which people feel very uncomfortable, or can feel uncomfortable. So a week is not enough. And then if you're somebody who is on the side of wanting to create change more broadly, I would urge you to go to the Nutrition Coalition, which is nutritioncoalition.us, and just educate yourself on why our dietary policy, this dietary guidelines for Americans, why is it important? How does it impact you? How does it impact your children, the people, your elderly relative in a nursing home? Why is it something that needs to be changed? What is the science behind it? Is it worth trying to fight for that kind of change? I'll give you an example of a doctor. I mean, one of the reasons that I believe it has to change that might resonate with doctors is that a friend who's a medical student was having their one day of nutrition studies in medical school, and the doctor was basically teaching the dietary guidelines. And afterwards, my friend went up and said, "Well, doctor, have you been following all this literature on ketogenic diets or low carb diets? I mean, it's you didn't mention it at all." And he responded, "Well, I myself am ketogenic." He said, "But I'm not allowed. The rules do not allow for me to teach this to anybody else."
Shocking.
And that's because of the dietary guidelines. So we need to loosen up the system such that there are at least a diversity of options. I mean, nobody's saying it should be for all people, but we need to have options for the diverse population that we are in America. And so, learning how to take action or educating people at your own hospital or your own medical practice or your own patients, or getting involved with the Nutrition Coalition or donating to the Nutrition Coalition. Any of those things are ways to try to get involved in a broader level.
Yeah, it all makes sense, and I'm so happy that we do have the Nutrition Coalition, out there trying to move that needle. So I think the more of us, hopefully, the awareness that comes from this podcast and the other interviews you'll be doing, and I'm sure you'll be talking to a lot of people because the guidelines are out. But I really, really think that's wonderful, and I always ask people, when you're trying to change the world, you start with yourself. So I'll ask my final question, which is, as it relates to we want to make sure you're healthy, make sure you're doing okay and you're thriving. So we have my Nest and Rope acronym. And again, that's based on the principles of functional medicine and the root cause of disease. And we need to make sure we're eating well, we're exercising, we're getting more sleep and having less stress, avoiding trauma. And we're making sure we're being positive thinkers and in positive relationships. We're avoiding harmful organisms. We're protecting our emotions, and we're making sure that our previous life experiences that we hold on to serve us. So when you think about 2021, what should be a great year for all of us, what areas do you plan to focus on, Nina?
In my life?
Yes.
I'm afraid I cannot disclose all the things that are not going well in my life.
It's all good. Just give us one nugget that won't harm you and your husband and the kids.
Having my kids do their own laundry, that would be a really great step forward in my household.
It's funny you said. I'm gonna say this real quick. I was just giving some comments about that, and sometimes, could you imagine having clothes washed and folded, and they're sitting on your child's bed, and the only thing that you get out of your child is, when are you going to move these clothes off my bed? This just happened. This just happened like 2 days ago. I'm like, what the? So, and it's like the labor of doing all of this work on your behalf, and that's all I get out of you. So we're on the same page, and I completely understand.
That would make my life a lot less stressful, and not being screamed at for helping my child with his Spanish homework. I mean, we live in such exceptional times. I think that I wrote this to a friend towards the beginning of the pandemic, and I said to her, I'm not trying to be my best self. I'm just trying not to be my worst self every day.
Wow.
So I think I've actually made some progress on that. So, I'm lucky enough to live close to a path in the woods, and I try to go walking every day. And I feel like that is, just staying sane so that you can be good to the people around you is, I think, a good goal to have.
I like that. And I also want to say, it's funny, my oldest son, who's now 23, he started a podcast, which I've mentioned before, Ritmos Negros, and
nice.
His name is Brandon Hampton. So it talks about the Latin American and African American connection, and how salsa and things like that actually have roots in Africa, which I didn't know this stuff. So it's a really great podcast. So I'm doing a plug for him, but I bring it up because you mentioned Spanish. So my sons were not excited about Spanish at first, but now they both speak fluently. So there's hope. Just hang in there and try to find a way to make it more interesting, or, it's all about the teacher. And if you have a really good teacher, it's going to be better. So it's hard though. Yeah. So
just during COVID, I used to be a huge salsa dancer. I absolutely love salsa.
He's going to die when he hears this. I'm going to tell him.
I adore salsa and merengue and cumbia.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I'm mad for that music. And, unfortunately we can't get out and dance now, but I do think it's a great way to get into the language. I learned a lot of it singing.
Yeah, seriously.
So anyway, I'm going to go look up your son's podcast. What is his name?
It's Brandon Hampton, and it's called Rhythmus is Ritmos, Negros.
Ritmos Negros.
Negro. Yeah, make sure the kids check that out. And by the way, this is what's so cool, and that's why I want to inspire your kids. He does an English and a Spanish version. These
Oh,
kids, it's insane.
fantastic.
I mean,
Oh,
I'm like, whoa. Yeah, so the
fantastic.
kids, I mean, we're pretty smart people, but let me tell you, the next generation,
Yeah, I
they
know.
do their thing. It's
I'm
beautiful to see.
happy to step aside. All right. Well, I'm at his
Yeah,
website and I'm going to sign up for his podcast.
absolutely. Thank you for that,
Wonderful.
and thank you. And I want to thank you again. You shared the Nutrition Coalition. Go ahead and share your other hooks on social media so people know where to find you.
Yes. Well, my Twitter account is at Big Fat Surprise, one word, which is the name of my book. My own webpage is ninateichholz.com. And Teicholz, it's all one word, Ninateichholz, but hopefully that'll be in your podcast links. And I'm on Facebook under my name, and that's pretty much it. There are videos of me all over YouTube, but I don't have them collected in any one convenient place, I'm afraid.
Definitely will find those. Of course, I had to look at a couple of those as I thought about our conversation. But I think there's plenty out there, and it's fascinating. So thank you for spending some time with me. I enjoyed it. I was looking forward to this. You've inspired me again. It was one more quick story. It's so funny. This is when you know your parents are not paying attention. So I tell my mom, I said, Mom, I wrote an article for the Chicago Tribune. You should check that out.
Huge. Yeah.
I'm like, this is a big deal, right?
Yeah, it is.
And you know what she says? Oh, that's cute, but can you take me to the store to get my lotteries? I'm like, what the? I'm like, wait a minute. I'm like, Mom, I'm like, you're killing me. So you have to just take things for what they are and move on. And of course, we took our trips to get the lottery. So it is what it is. So, but thank you for your great story.
I was super impressed by your Chicago Tribune op-ed, which is a huge deal to be published. So, and it's a great op-ed, and I really encourage your listeners to read it. It's very, very well done.
Absolutely. We'll have that in the show notes, and thank you for your inspiration. And I'll continue to support what you're doing because it affects all of us. So
thank you.
I'll let you get out of here. You go do your thing, and I'll say a few closing comments. Guys, this was a great podcast. Today we were given some clarity on the difference between observational studies, which are used to demonstrate a hypothesis, and experimental studies, which are used to demonstrate a causal relationship. You know, with that clarity, Nina has shown us that the dietary guidelines did not meet the standard of causation. You should therefore ask yourself, should the standard that determines what 1/3 of Americans eat be based on weak science? I think you know the answer to that question. And actually, I went to Nina's website, and this is what I read from the Nutrition Coalition. The question was, what went wrong? The answer is that in many cases, the guidelines have been shown to be based on weak science, and the government's evidence reviews have failed to comprehensively or systematically consider the best and most current science. Our nutrition policy is not based on strong scientific evidence. The guidelines do not give us the right advice about how to eat if you're diabetic, obese, have heart disease, or things like Alzheimer's. So these guidelines must be reformed so that they are based on the best and most rigorous science. Only then will we be able to help Americans fight nutrition-related diseases. So that was from Nina's website. I agree with Nina. I agree with the Nutrition Coalition. And if you do, I suggest you support them. And again, we'll give you a link to those sites. So I hope this episode has given you some insights that will shape how you view guidelines in the future, because if we are to protect our nests and the nests of the ones we love and even our nation, we must have guidelines that serve us. So until we meet again, I ask you to continue to be safe, be well, and to continue to protect your nest. You've been listening to Protecting Your Nest with Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com.